All right, everyone. Good afternoon. If you are here in Central and Eastern Time, good morning if you're out on the Pacific side of things. My name is Jonathan Mast. I'm a senior consultant here with Rackspace. Work on our services team, helping deliver solutions for all of our customers, both, I guess, developer related and both really an out-of-the-box scenarios as well. So we're going to talk about apps today. Before we do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, which is one of my favorite topics, and then we will go on into an agenda and into the good stuff. So what do I do for Rackspace? That is a picture of me, in case you're curious what I look like. Sometimes that's helpful for folks on these webinars that can't see my face. I do have a blog that is at that address, and certainly love your feedback on Twitter as well. I work out of our Cincinnati location here in Rackspace, and actually live in northern Kentucky, just south of the airport. I have a couple of kids, a third one on the way, and I've been doing SharePoint for about 10 years, and you'll hear about some of my experiences when I talk a little bit about the history of SharePoint development. So we have an agenda. We're going to talk through a kind of a high level why we have apps now, or why we believe that we have apps, why Microsoft provided this kind of new delivery platform. And I think a great way to go through and understand how we got to this app model is to kind of go back and look at what we've had in the past and how we solved problems in the past in SharePoint and integrating with other systems. So we'll talk about why we have apps. We'll talk about what apps can do and get excited about that. And then we'll talk about what they can't do, and we'll be kind of disappointed maybe. And then we'll talk about some of the technical details, like what are apps, what really are they from a technical perspective. We'll talk about the different kinds of apps and maybe more specifically a lecture around, or a couple of slides around the different ways that you can deploy apps. Talk about app webs, what that means. These are all technical details around the deployment, their security, and also the tools and the libraries that we can use to build apps. And we'll close with a demonstration briefly about kind of the configuration of an app environment. I think that's kind of an important scenario about how Microsoft set SharePoint up to kind of deliver apps in this isolated environment within an infrastructure, within the SharePoint infrastructure. So we'll talk a little bit about demo. We'll deploy a Hello World app, and then I'll save maybe 5 minutes for questions to the end. Please feel free to use the software, the GoToWebinar software. There should be a place to ask questions if you're logged into the webinar through the GoToMeeting software. There should be a place to ask questions. Feel free to put your questions in there, and as they come, I will certainly do my best to answer them between slides, or as best I can. We're targeting about 35 to 40 minutes for this webinar. So I'll do my best to kind of keep pace and save time for questions. So let's do some of the silly slides around, how we got to SharePoint development and this kind of new app model. So if we go back to the old days of SharePoint 2003 and SharePoint Portal Server and the WSS 2.0 platform, Windows SharePoint Services 2.0, we as developers had very little available to us from a platform perspective. We were kind of in this prehistoric age of the dinosaur land where we could build web parts, and we could deploy those with this really clunky command line tool called WP Packager, which actually built this MSI out of our code and deployed it into and deployed it into the farm for us, and the DLLs and the web config changes that were required. You had to mess a lot with code access security back then, which was very frustrating for developers. And a lot of times back then when you were building web parts, the hardest part was just getting to a place where you could deploy something and iterate over your code. So we moved on, right? We moved on beyond 2003 after we experienced that web part development in that WP packager, and we got into the 2007 environment, and everybody got really excited because we got tools, right? We entered the tools age. It's like we invented fire. Right, we had all of these great things with the solution infrastructure. We could deploy features and solution packages and custom actions and delegate controls, and we had all of this opportunity to really customize the SharePoint runtime, right? The load and the render of the page. We had all of these different hooks that we could get into. But what we found was that with this great power became this really terrifying responsibility, and we could do some bad things to our farm as we built out our customizations and our solutions. And so we went from this world in 2003, very limited customizations capabilities, no branding, kind of archaic ASP.NET. You know, ASP.NET 2.0 came out, and all the SharePoint developers were so bummed that they didn't have an opportunity to take advantage of these new tools like master pages and custom themes and those sorts of things. And so 2007 comes along, and it's built on ASP.NET 2.0, and we get forms-based authentication and master pages and all of these tools. And we go crazy. And then some of the admins start getting a little frustrated because maybe some of the developed solutions weren't built in the best way possible, or maybe we over-customized certain sites so that it just couldn't possibly work really well. The initial guidance around best practices wasn't that rich in terms of what capacity we had as developers or what kind of load we could put on those servers. So we got into some trouble, and we started to tear down the farms. And bad things maybe happened when we didn't intend them to. So we moved into SharePoint 2010, and we moved to the 4.0 version of the platform, and we called it SharePoint Foundation. And this became kind of our age of enlightenment. The first thing we heard about was sandbox solutions. All of these great things that we could build with sandbox solutions in SharePoint 2010. You could do all the, you wouldn't even really need to build a farm solution anymore. And it turns out that was just completely incorrect, because the limitations of sandbox solutions, in addition to the monitoring and the overhead that you paid, basically what we were told was there was a very limited set of features that you could take advantage of in sandbox solutions, and oh, by the way, everything's going to take longer as well. So not that exciting from a tools perspective. But we did have these other tools from a platform perspective come about that kind of came under the radar a little bit, right? And those are through new REST APIs in the client-side object model. So all of a sudden we had these other ways to interact with SharePoint and SharePoint data that we didn't have before, right? In 2007, if you wanted to work with SharePoint data, you were either on the server and you were writing C# or VB.NET against the SharePoint server APIs. And if you were off the server in 2007, all you had available to you was the kind of ASMX classic web services. In 2010, you know, we had our OData feeds, Excel services got a REST API, and a lot, not all of it, but a lot of the server API also got these client-side object model libraries that we could call into from other places, from within the browser using JavaScript, or within a Silverlight application using the .NET runtime, or even just somewhere else, some other web server or some other client application could still call into SharePoint and could fetch data and pass things back and forth over the wire. And so then we got through 2010. We provided feedback to Microsoft, and we said, you know what, sandbox solutions are a great idea, but in practicality, the limitations are too great. We're not going to use them. We just end up building farm solutions anyway. So then we came into the 2013 world, and that's where we are today. And now we'll call it the digital age. And this is where we start to see this idea of, well, sandbox solutions, right now there's an article out there that says they're deprecated, but I think they're probably going to backtrack on that a little bit. And they're just going to go with, what we really want you to do is build apps first. Try and solve your problem with an app. If you can't do that, then start to look at sandbox solutions or a farm solution. So we deliver this app model, and we expand the capabilities of the client-side object model in REST. So still, we don't have 100% parity between our CSOM and our REST APIs and our server APIs. In fact, I don't think we even have parity between CSOM and REST and our sandbox solution APIs, but there's still quite a bit there. There's a lot of functionality in a platform. There's a good platform there to build solutions. And what you're going to see, and what we're going to talk about here in the next couple of slides, is not so much that you're going to take what you used to do in the sandbox solution from a functional perspective or from a code-by-code, line-by-line perspective, but you're going to take some of those use cases that you used, the sandbox and even sometimes a farm solution, and you're going to be able to solve those use cases with an app in kind of a safer, more reproducible, more I don't know what the word is, monetizable or a better way that you can actually earn some money on some of your apps. So moving on, why do we have apps? And this is kind of my perspective. Someone in Redmond had an idea, and they realized that whenever you ran the pre-upgrade checker and you had a farm solution installed in your environment, you would get a big long thing from the pre-upgrade checker of red text that said, these farm solutions are going to work when you upgrade. And that is a bad thing for Microsoft, right? They figured out that SharePoint plus farm solutions equals a harder upgrade. And they don't want it to be a harder upgrade. They want it to be an easy upgrade, right? That's what they want you to do, keep buying new versions of the software. So apps are really there to allow your farm to be run in a, I don't want to say a vacuum, but that's kind of what it is, right? Let's let the farm just get installed and live and run as much as it can as it was initially built, right? Let's keep all of our customizations or all of our extensions and our integrations on their own hardware, on their own software, on their own platforms. So we kind of baseline why apps are there. They're to protect the farm, first of all, from a performance perspective, and they're to protect the upgrade process so that there's no reason for you when 2013 or 2015 or 16 or whatever the next version is comes out, there's no reason for you to say, you know what, I just got too much stuff here, it's going to be too expensive, we're probably just going to wait for the next version. So what are the apps? What can we do with them? How do they work? What does it mean when we say this is a SharePoint app? Kind of at maybe an oversimplified level, apps themselves are packages with permission to access SharePoint data and APIs remotely. They are literally a .app file that contains a WSP, and what happens is the app has a manifest file, and when the app gets installed, SharePoint kind of interrogates that manifest, similar to how it does with solutions and features today. And part of the app manifest, we'll see this later, it actually has specific permission requests that the app will request when it's installed. They don't allow any code to run on SharePoint servers, sandbox or otherwise, so you will not be able to hook into any of the server APIs from your app. Now, we'll see that your app is able to run elsewhere, like you could put it on a web server in your infrastructure, or you could put it on an Azure website or in a third-party hosted website, and it can use the client-side object models to run back into SharePoint and get and manipulate data that way. We'll see, or you'll have the opportunity to kind of see at a high level how permissions flow between SharePoint, your app, or the app itself, and the STS, the security platforms in between. It's very Facebook-like. I don't know if you guys, if folks have used Facebook before, but when you install an app or when you give something permission to talk to Facebook, it kind of gives you this laundry list of stuff that it wants, that Facebook wants to give it permission, right? Like your email address or your personal details, the ability to send email on behalf of you, all these things. And those, that window looks very similar in SharePoint. It actually will give you a laundry list of permissions that SharePoint or that the app wants from SharePoint, and the only difference is really that in SharePoint you can either give all of the permissions or none of them, whereas in Facebook you kind of get this ability to check off which ones you can or can't use. The other big part of the app story is the fact that there is a marketplace or a catalog. I guess you would consider the online versions the marketplace and the local one a catalog. So you're able to put apps into your corporate catalog, and then you can distribute the functionality that way. Your users can take the site and they can install your apps, and there's an update process so that as you release new versions of the app, it automatically gets pushed out to everywhere where it's installed. And I think the biggest thing that an app is that's different from a sandbox solution and a farm solution is that in general, when you built a sandbox or a farm solution, the components in those solutions were really nothing really made them be a full standalone unit of functionality, right? One solution could just be a collection of web parts that were built to be used as composites, as a part of a composite solution all over the farm. Apps are really meant to be just like what it says, right? Like an app you would install on your phone. When you install it into your SharePoint site, it's there to solve a purpose, right? It's there to solve a problem, and it's there to solve 100% of that problem. So a good example of an app would be like an RFP manager, right? If your organization responds or sends lots of proposals out, the app could do the work of creating a document from a template and then associating tasks and having workflows to assign tasks to users and those sorts of things. And at the end of the day, all of the functionality is handled within the app. Nothing gets persisted to the host site that it was installed in, with the exception of a few components. I put this diagram here. I've got a couple of pictures that I pulled out of MSDN articles, and I think this kind of provides an idea of the stuff that an app can do. The first is that you have an immersive full page, and that's this view on the left here. And that basically is you've got SharePoint with your branding, and then an iframe, and then your app. Even if the app lives in what is known as a SharePoint hosted environment, it is iframed into the host site. The second window shows what's called an app part, and basically this is just a small iframe that you can drag and drop onto the host site like a web part that shows an iframed version of a page in your app. And the other thing you're able to do, which actually doesn't work in the beta right now, so even if I did have a demo for this, it wouldn't work. Actually, my demo tries to deploy a custom action. It doesn't work. But what the custom action actually allows you to do is put additional ribbon buttons that can call into your app, either link to an iframe or send a message to like a remote event receiver or something like those, some component like that. So that is what we would kind of a high level of how we would define apps. What aren't apps? Like I've already said, apps will not replace farm or sandbox solutions. There's just certain things that you can do in the farm and the sandbox that you can't do in an app, and that's the way it's going to be. Remember, they're basically for two different types of solutions, right? Apps are standalone components built to solve a specific problem 100%. Whereas farm and sandbox solutions can be all kinds of different things, right? You can build a farm solution that that deploys web parts, that modifies web configs, that creates a site template, that deploys user controls or delegate controls, that deploys custom ribbon buttons, right? We have all of these different capabilities in the farm in the sandbox solution that you either can't do with parity in an app or you can't do it all in an app. But the thing to think about is from an app perspective is that you can still solve a lot of those problems by building an app. It's just in a different way. It's just using a different mechanism or a different platform. So I think a lot of SharePoint developers are kind of looking at the app model today, and either they're writing it off altogether or they are looking at it with a lot of skepticism because they're looking at it from the perspective of how they do things on the 2010 platform or the 2007 platform when they're building farm and sandbox solutions. So it's an opportunity to kind of learn to solve problems a different way. It's an opportunity, if you can build a reusable app, it's an opportunity to make some money because you can put it into the Office marketplace and the SharePoint marketplace, and you can make it available to users everywhere. And there's a couple of things that we commonly use SharePoint solutions for, particularly on our team at Rackspace, around like branding solutions or to deploy things to the host site. And what I mean by the host site, we'll talk about that on the next slide. But basically, any time that you need to customize a site in existence, an app is going to provide not a best practice solution for that. So let's look at some of the app hosting solutions here. How does PowerPoint work? Here we go. So this is another image that I did pull out of Microsoft's TechNet. And it really describes the three different types of apps, or the hosting types. And there's really two that I think, well, I won't editorialize too much. I think most people will start with the SharePoint hosted apps just because they're the easiest to get off the ground. And what SharePoint hosted apps basically are a website that gets created in a very specific web application that's specifically configured to host app webs. So what happens is an app gets published to the catalog or the marketplace, and a user chooses to install that app. And we'll see this in the demo, but the app, when it gets installed, SharePoint will actually create a blank site within the app domain, and it'll install the app into that site. And everything that the app does, deploys, provisions, what have you, is in that site. So it's in a vacuum, right? It doesn't actually modify what would be considered the host site. And so with all of these hosting options, that app web, if you see here, is available to you. So like with a SharePoint hosted app, your solution might might include a series of lists, web parts, and content pages that gets deployed. When the host site installs that app, another the app web will get created within the app domain, and all of those web parts, all of those pages, all of those things are available inside of the app web. Nothing actually gets deployed to the host site where the app was actually installed. The only things that would be available in the host site would be those custom actions that may or may not get, I guess, broadcast by the app itself, or those app parts that I described in a couple slides previous. So there's three different types of apps, and from a hosting perspective. The one on the top is probably the most complex in terms of just getting it set up and configured. And that's known as a provider hosted. And this is where your app actually lives on some web server elsewhere than SharePoint. That can be a server at Rackspace. That could be a cloud sites application at Rackspace. It could be an application on Windows Azure. It could be just another IIS server that you have in your enterprise's infrastructure. What happens with a provider-hosted app is that it gets the logic gets completely decoupled. And this is a pretty positive thing because you have more tools at your disposal, right? You could write your app on any platform, right? It could be a PHP app that just calls into SharePoint when it needs it. It could be an MVC app with ASP.NET, right? And you could still, you'd have the flexibility then of writing your client-side object model code using the .NET libraries, which can be beneficial because that full .NET runtime of the client-side object model doesn't require you to do any asynchronous programming. So it's a little bit easier to move data back and forth. The crux or the complication of the cloud or the provider-hosted app is that from a security perspective, SharePoint still needs to have some way to authorize your app when it needs to call in and out of the server, in and out of the SharePoint server. And the way it does that is through OAuth. And when you're in the provider-hosted world, the OAuth either has to come through ACS, which would require you to have a Windows Azure account, and every time you authenticate from the app to the provider-hosted server, basically you would pay for that authentication on your ACS account through in Windows Azure. Or you can create this fallback, which is called a high trust configuration between your provider-hosted app and your SharePoint portal, which I guess you can see that, look at that from a lot of different perspectives. It's nice that we can build these provider apps, but it's not it really doesn't work from a there's some complications there if you're trying to scale out your app across organizations, right? That fallback high trust setting is really just there so that you can build apps within your enterprise. You have control of the infrastructure, so on and so forth. The next one we call an auto-hosted app, and this is specifically for Office 365 implementations. And what you're able to do is you're actually able to describe what type of Windows Azure resources your app needs. And this can be, I mean, it's the same as saying, you know, my app needs a 4 gigabyte application web server, and it needs a SQL database of this size. And what happens is when your app is installed by the Office 365 site, it actually goes ahead and auto provisions those components to the customer's Windows Azure account. So it provides a really easy way to build these provider-hosted apps without having to set up any of your own hosting infrastructure. The unfortunate side of this is that your app is only available to Office 365 farms or Office 365 accounts. And then the one at the bottom we've already talked about is the SharePoint hosted app. And this is basically where your app gets installed into SharePoint, and the only thing you have available to you is HTML and JavaScript. You won't be able to do any server-side code. Sounds very limiting, but as you dig into the new advancements to the client-side object model and the REST APIs and the things that you can do today that you couldn't do in 2010, there's actually quite a lot of power there in terms of what type of apps you could build. All right, so a brief slide on the app programming model. So we have with SharePoint in 2010 just about all of these tools, with the exception of libraries for iOS and Android, which presumably will be out sometime after release. So you'll have native libraries to talk to SharePoint on just about every major OS, desktop and mobile. We have an expanded, and when we talk about the client libraries, these guys up here, those are specific SharePoint libraries for making calls into SharePoint. It kind of wraps up the back-end REST or JSON messaging that happens between the two. So on the client, we're able to build these HTML web apps. We're able to build these JavaScript applications, and we can call these APIs in SharePoint either through REST or any of the client libraries that are described. And we actually get now, in addition to all the stuff that was already there, we get these web APIs that are available to our client libraries. So we're able to do things like discover stuff about the project team with a project site. We're able to run search queries against the search API, and we're able to go and get documents and metadata through the lists API. So there's some new endpoints there that we can query. The old ones are still there as well, but as you dig into some of these, you'll find a pretty feature-rich set of tools. A slide on app security, and this is far and away the most complex topic when it comes to SharePoint apps. But at a high level, SharePoint relies on OAuth 2.0 for security tokens. This is 100% authorization only. It does not use OAuth for authentication. You still are, or when you deal with authentication to SharePoint, you're still doing the same stuff. You have claims, you have Windows claims, you have SAML claims, you have, I guess, what they call forms-based claims, which is just a layer on top of SAML claims. But what happens is apps get, whenever you install an app gets this app-specific identity. And so what will happen is the host web itself will actually have an OAuth identity or a principal, an identity principal that gets translated from an OAuth token. We have app manifests that define what permissions an app may require, and that looks kind of like, hopefully you guys can see in the bottom right hand corner, a sample of what those permissions look like. And the gotcha there is when you install an app, you as the installer of the app have to have the same permissions that the app is requesting in order to grant them. So in this case, if you look over on the right-hand side for these app permission requests, the first one asks for the ability to read data from the SharePoint website, and the second permission asks for the ability to write data to SharePoint lists within the SharePoint website. The image above this shows the transmission of security data for off-premise apps. So these are those provider-hosted apps. And what happens is, if you just kind of follow the numbers, first a browser makes a request to the SharePoint server. The SharePoint server forwards the request to the STS, the OAuth STS, which in most cases will be ACS, but could also be an internal STS for the high-trust configurations. The STS authenticates the user or authenticates the app and passes the OAuth token back to SharePoint. SharePoint then sends the OAuth token to the browser. The browser forwards the token onto the location of the provider-hosted app. The provider-hosted app goes and re-authenticates the token against the STS, passes that back into the provider-hosted app, and then that goes into SharePoint, and that's how it determines whether or not you have access to content within SharePoint. No problem, right? Not confusing at all. I don't think so either. So that's kind of a high level of app security. I know there's a lot that I'm probably glossing over, but the important thing to take away here is that SharePoint uses OAuth to secure resources within the sites. Apps have access to those resources provided they're provisioned the appropriate security for those resources. Apps will tell the host app what type of permissions they need, and the only way an app can have those permissions is if the person who installs it grants them those permissions because they already have the permissions themselves. Okay. So then when we talk, wrong way, so then we talk about the tools and libraries available to us to build apps. And we've got about 5-10 minutes left, so we're going to race through this stuff. But this is kind of the funny thing about technology. When I first started with SharePoint, we built solutions that integrated with SharePoint Portal Server with 2003. And the way we did that was every once in a while, I mean like very seldom, maybe 5% of the time, we'd build a custom web part. But the vast majority of the time, we would actually take an ASP.NET solution that we built, we would build a few custom pages specifically for SharePoint, and we would actually iframe them in. And if the ASP.NET solution needed to move data in or out of the SharePoint site, it would do that through the lists web service, list.asmx. It still exists today. And the ironic thing is today, when we look at this app model, we're back to where we were almost 10 years ago. Granted, we have a lot more tools that are available to us, right? We've got the client-side object models over here. We've got REST APIs, and we have a much richer JavaScript ecosystem, so we can build these really fast JavaScript apps, and the browsers do a good job, or fast JavaScript interpreters. And maybe the big thing that we have now, of course, is Visual Studio 2012, which actually has native support for building and packaging apps. But the point is that you could have built apps like this really ever since, I mean, if you want to talk about the APIs being available, you could have built them since 2010 came out, back in 2009, the end of 2009 or early 2010. But if you want to talk about the provider-hosted apps where you aren't necessarily dependent on JavaScript to talk to SharePoint, we've been able to do this for a very long time. In fact, there's probably lots of developers out there that have built or done something just like this. And so the idea is now you can look at it one of two ways. You can look at it as that we're going back into the dark ages before we invented fire, or you can look at it as that you have become liberated from the walls and boundaries that you've had put on you from SharePoint development, right? In 2010, we had one runtime that we could code against. We had one set of libraries that we could use. We had no availability to use some of the richer texts in terms of ASP.NET MVC, or if you wanted to build your app in Java or whatever flavor fit your skill set the best, you had no availability for that. And now today we do. We'll be able to build apps using and leveraging the SharePoint platform, basically, however we as developers want to do that. And that's pretty exciting. The next thing we're going to talk about, nobody has asked any questions. That must mean I'm either doing a wonderful job explaining all these topics, or it's so confusing that nobody understands anything that I'm saying. Probably somewhere in the middle, hopefully. So the next thing we're going to talk about is just app deployment and what that looks like. And I was starting to write this slide a couple days ago, and it just was too hard to really put into words, or to put into text at least. So what we're going to do is actually show a little demo here. Hopefully this will work out. So let us switch over first to our SharePoint 2013 server. It looks like everybody can see this. It's floating in front of our PowerPoint presentation. We'll make it bigger. There we go. So I have Visual Studio open right now, but first let's switch over to Central Admin. The first thing that you do when you set up an app domain is you configure this kind of auto-generated URL for the app, or you configure how that URL is going to get generated. And you actually do this from Central Admin. So when we come to Central Admin from pretty much anywhere, you can go to the apps page within Central Admin, and you can click on Configure App URLs. And this is really simple. I actually did this through PowerShell, not even realizing that this page existed the first time I did it. But we set up two things. The first is the domain, where we are going to deploy all of our apps. And what this has to be is a very basic web application. It has to live on port 80, and it, I believe, cannot have a host header URL. Basically, it has to be easily discoverable by anyone accessing the site. The other thing we do is define an app prefix, and this is just so that we have some, I guess, consistency in the subdomain of all of our app URLs. And you'll see in a minute just why that's important. So the next thing that we do is we switch over to Visual Studio, and we take a look at what an app looks like. And this is my Hello World app. When you create a new app in Visual Studio 2012, You go to New Project, you click on SharePoint Solutions, and somewhere in here we have a apps node right here. Actually, for some reason they put them separately. So app for SharePoint 2013, you click OK. It wants to know what you want to call your app. It wants to know where you want to debug your app, which I have a special site specifically for that named App Dev. And it wants to know what kind of app I want, how I want to host this app. And we want to build this as a SharePoint app. So we're going to hit Finish. And we're going to see all these cool things that it spits up. It gives us containers for scripts, goes ahead and creates a default.aspx page for us, and gives us an app icon so that when we install it into the marketplace, it looks like every other app that didn't bother to change their app icon. But at least there's something there. Well, we also get a CSS. This looks a lot like what you would consider a .NET web app to start up with, right? You get some pages, some images, and some content, and a scripts folder with all of your jQuery and a place to put all of your special app.js. So if we fast forward and switch back to my previous project, which I didn't think would close, we'll go back over here. Lightning Fast Visual Studio, here we go, and kind of take a look at what this does. There we go. I'll try and go slow. It looks like the web meeting is taking a little while to update. The Hello World app, I've just basically configured this to deploy a custom list within the app. And what you'll see is, if I pull this guy up, if you guys are familiar with these custom list assets, where is it here? Here we go. Basically, it just creates a custom list with no columns. But I go ahead and create an instance of that list as well. So what I've got right now is whenever this app gets installed, I create a custom list named test custom list, and I create an instance of that custom list named test custom list. Additionally, we are going to go ahead and create a page here, default.aspx, and this page is going to throw some JavaScript around and put some widgets on there. First thing we're going to do is use this app iframe to show bing.com, and that can actually point to any URL. It's just an iframe. I'm going to put a button on there that's going to run some client-side object model, some JavaScript. It's going to get I think it's going to get like a count of all the lists in the current app web. And then we're going to throw a web part on there that shows a list view of my custom list. So when I build this, if I click F5 or if I push F5 or click Start, it's going to uninstall the app for SharePoint. And it's going to work because it's beta software, and beta software always works. It's going to install my app for SharePoint. And here we are. So you'll see that on hopefully you attended the other webinars, you understand that everything is an app now, but we also see my Hello World app here. When I click on this, it's actually going to launch my app, and hopefully everybody, you can pay attention to the URL here of what comes up. It's going to prompt me for credentials. Of course it is, but check out that URL it wants to connect me to. And we're working on it. See that? Can you guys see that? Yes, we're working on it. So it's going to take a second for it to warm up. And while it does that, we are going to switch over and hit the, oh, no, here we are. So this is the page that you guys just saw, or at least I just showed you. Notice the URL here. If I can't zoom in because I don't have that software on my computer, but if I show you guys this URL, it's got our prefix here. It starts with app-blah, blah, 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 some random GUID that it just generated, and it gets created at our app domain, which I called mastlabapps.local. On our page, we run this client-side object model, which gets a number of lists in the current web set to 3. And you see that we have this custom list here, this list view web part, where we can do things like create items on the list. So that is the 1,000-foot view of deploying an app web. Let us switch back to the slides, and we will race through these, and I will do my best to answer any questions. There is additional information here. There is a great SharePoint overview for app developers on MSDN, and then they actually have a nice series that goes and walks through a lot of common use cases for querying data with CSOM and with REST and those sorts of things. Register for the remaining webcasts. Randy is going to start his branding webcast here in about 14 minutes. And so if you guys want to go put your skinny jeans on and do some creative stuff with Randy, there will be your opportunity. These are all of the 2013 webcasts we've done this week. Hopefully you get an opportunity. If you didn't see them the first time, there's an opportunity for you to see the recorded versions here in the next few days. I am completely out of time, so I apologize. I will not be able to take questions, but if you would, feel free to email me any questions at this email address, or you can Twitter me at Jonathan P. Mast, and I just crashed PowerPoint. So that actually is supposed to say at Jonathan P. Mast, but apparently I won't be allowed to finish that. Again, out of time. I apologize. We got to get set up for Randy's. Please feel free to. Let me pause that. To get you guys to send any questions my way, and I appreciate everybody's attendance. Thanks so much.